I have just beaten Dark Souls 2, and if I were to say anything, I am tired. There have been most certainly ups, but so many downs concerning this game. It's just been a roller coaster when it gets down to it. And I'll have you guys know that this was simply my opinion, and everything I say in this video may only apply to my line of thinking and could be completely polar opposite to how you yourself experienced Dark Souls 2. I do not want to put off the vibe that what I say is utterly definitive because, as I said in one of my previous videos, one of the many beauties of Dark Souls is the fact that everyone has difficulties, gripes, easy moments, and things that they love when it comes to these games. This video is just a collection of my own ups and downs concerning Dark Souls 2. Let's dive straight into the first part about the game that I feel needs to be addressed. The themes and the overall atmosphere were something that I felt did not hit the mark From was attempting to hit. In Dark Souls 1, a sense of apathy for the world permeated the air. No one really cared that you were around. Everyone was doing their own thing and had their own concerns to handle. All that alongside the constant laughter that broke the silence. Dark Souls 3 had a sense of urgency and drive. Lothric denied his legacy of linking the flame, and all the previous Lords of Cinder followed in his stead. Therefore, the Unkindled arose and were called in a last-ditch effort to prevent the Age of Dark. The world was relying on you to save it. And in Dark Souls 2, from what I experienced, wanted to establish a sense of hopelessness. You were going to lose your souls and die repeatedly. You should just give up while you're ahead because you are no match for this game. However, Dark Souls 2 did not really give me that feeling, let alone provide me the means to simply suspend my disbelief enough to play along with that desired atmosphere. For about 95% of the game, all I could imagine was From kicking their feet up on a table, leaning back in their chair, popping a conceited smirk, and saying, hard, right? The thing is though, From had a big piece of food stuck in their teeth, which, in the end, makes them look ridiculous. The entire opening sequence involves you, the player, getting berated by a bunch of old fire keepers repeating the same old, tired line that you're going to die, followed by collective laughter. In fact, many, if not most of the NPCs' dialogue has a jab at you in one way or another, saying things along the lines of, "Oh, I didn't expect to see you back," or, "It doesn't matter really, you're gonna die anyway, see ya." From, I'm guessing to establish this hopelessness, wanted to make it out to where the world was against you, even the people you were supposed to consider allies. In my case, it felt more like From was making fun of me. From appeared to direct the themes of the game from above, if that makes any sense. In other words, many of the NPCs talked down to the player, and it does not at all create the discouragement that was sought, in my opinion. I could very well be wrong about all of this, about how From wanted to establish the game's themes, but if From did want to create a forlorn atmosphere, I think that the game expressing that hopelessness to itself alongside the player would have been the optimal route. Instead of trying to push the player down, have the game drag him from below, changing dialogue lines from, "I'm not even going to beat around the bush anymore, you're going to die," to, "It doesn't matter, you, me, and everyone else is going to die anyway." Would have been leagues more effective from my point of view. All in all, I was just, in a way, pissed off that From would just look down on the player and laugh about how difficult the game was going to be. If anything, difficulty is to be expected. I had better be beaten to a pulp, and I do not think the demographic drawn to games like Dark Souls play expecting the experience to be easy. That is the thing though, the piece of food stuck right in the middle of From's stuck-up smirk as they leaned back in their chair, roaring over how they developed a difficult game. From the outset of the game, an air of conceited, unfounded pride was palpable. This game was going to, supposedly, be the most difficult thing you were going to face, and I want to now talk about what did make the game, in my eyes, quite difficult. Putting every aspect of the game into account, the part that killed me the most, bar none, was the environment. Never more had I ever seen From throw environmental hazards at the player's way than with Dark Souls 2. It may be my lack of memory concerning the other two Souls games, or it may have been that I did not even notice the environmental aspects of Dark Souls 1 or 3 as much as I saw in 2. but I can say there have never been more moments where I was subjected to poison, fire, cursed, or being pushed off the edge of a cliff or a narrow walkway than in Dark Souls 2. Getting to the bosses was by far the most difficult aspect of Dark Souls 2, for the base game at least. I'll talk about the DLC a bit later. Getting back on track, it may have been invalid to point out how much Dark Souls 2 made it to where the environment was the most dangerous part of the game, because in Dark Souls 1, you have places like Blighttown, Anor Londo, New Londo Ruins, Valley of Drakes, Crystal Cave, and others I cannot remember at the top of my head that involved you being on the cusp of death solely because it would take a small push to end you immediately. Therefore, to be fair, with the sheer amount of areas in the game, I would say that Dark Souls 2 has maybe a proportional number of areas, give or take a couple, to Dark Souls 1, where the environment was designed to mess with you more than the enemies. On the other hand, the whole idea behind how these environmental hazards being, from my point of view, the hardest part about the game, really does say something about From. When it comes to Dark Souls 1, it appeared to me that the world's ability to kill you more than the enemies was more of an elbow jab to the shoulder than anything else. When From went to make Dark Souls 2, it was like a little brother trying to show up and prove himself, so he sucker punches you in the kidney and stands proud that he brought you down. From might be laughing and mocking over how they supposedly made a hard game, but when the most difficult part is getting around and to the bosses, then I see that as a fatal flaw in design. Combat in the Souls series has varied, even if it's just slightly, between the 3 games in the franchise. Dark Souls 1 was very methodical, slow, and weighty. If you made a mistake, it became obvious within a few moments, or less, as you would, in most cases, take a hit. However, based on how the healing mechanics work, if you found a short opening, you could very quickly remedy that mistake with an Estus chug, and you could be back in the game. Dark Souls 3 was similar, but sped up by a factor of 10, to more closely match the speed of Bloodborne combat. The slow, defensive route was also noticeably weakened compared to Dark Souls 1. You, for the most part, could not simply stand there with your shield up until you can get around to backstabbing every enemy in your wake. From pushed the player towards trying to avoid incoming attacks rather than tanking every hit. And with the bosses, they urged the player to be more aggressive over engendering passivity to yield success. Dark Souls 2 was, in my eyes, the awkward, adolescent period between the 2 forms of combat. While it was not as quick and reactive as Dark Souls 3, it was not exactly the almost turn-based gameplay of Dark Souls 1. Not only that, the healing and other factors were noticeably changed in Dark Souls 2. I did not actually come into the realization of what From had actually done until I was about 80 to 85% through the game, with only about 4 bosses left in the base game and 2 of the DLC left to complete. For all that time in Dark Souls 2, I believed From artificially structured difficulty in the game by sticking multiple enemies on the player for most encounters, but that turned out to be a short-sighted view on the game. In the end, the world in terms of enemies, and even the amount of enemies, was not any more difficult than Dark Souls 1 or 3, rather, the player himself was weakened. From severely lengthening the Estus animation in effect to taking away invincibility frames from your roll, the player was dramatically altered to bring him down a notch from the base power experienced in both Dark Souls 1 and 3. This realization was an eye-opener for me because all of my frustrations were not due to the enemies or anything along those lines. It was the fact that I was essentially weaker than what I was used to. I'm not saying that sticking the player next to a cliff for 80% of the game was fine, because I'm still salty about that. But for the longest time, I had a decent amount of trouble actually traversing the world in order to get to the bosses, which we'll discuss after this. When it gets right down to it, I cannot say that this was necessarily a bad change. In fact, if anything were to be done in order to make the game more difficult, it would perhaps be making the player, at least in the beginning, a substantial amount weaker, without going overboard, of course. Having the roll lose invincibility frames forced me to learn when to exactly dodge certain attacks. Otherwise, I would most likely get hit due to my lowered time frame to succeed. The same thing could be applied to the Estus Flash change. While there were, of course, life gems to pick up the slack of the weakened Estus, when you really think about it, the increased animation time and the slowed healing effect made the players choose wisely when to heal, because I can say from experience that I've been destroyed countless times by my lack of judgment on when to heal. I would end up getting stuck in the animation only for me to get hit regardless and have the healing not really mean much, or I would die outright. You became intimately aware of the timings the bosses had with his moves, and after putting in more consideration, if you know for certain that you could use an Estus without consequence, you could just about do anything, whether it be apply a resin or even repair your gear in the middle of a fight. I give props to Dark Souls 2 for this change in attempting to make the game more difficult. However, I would not object to minimizing the amount of encounters that involve 3, 4, 5, or even 6 enemies at once. That would be great. Now, let me move on to the bosses. With one of my analogies earlier, I said that with Dark Souls 2, From seemed to be coming at the player like they had their feet kicked up, leaning back in their chair, and smiling as they gloated over how difficult the game was going to be. The problem they had was that there was a piece of food blatantly stuck in the middle of their cocky smirk. That piece of food is the bosses. The thing that made me the most not angry or upset, but disappointed about Dark Souls 2, in the base game mainly, was that the bosses were some of the easiest I have ever fought in the entire series. There were very few bosses in the main game that took me more than 3 attempts, and for From to mock the player saying, "Ha ha ha, you're gonna die," only for the bosses, the part I actually wanted to be throttled by, to be mostly piss easy, that made me ultimately just sad. It may be unfair to say that due to my previous experience with the Souls games, and I mostly know what I'm doing, but the idea that From began the game by laughing at the players over how much they were going to die, only for me, someone who actually died to Covetous Demon once, to destroy most of the bosses with my eyes closed, that was it for me. It was not until the DLC, which I delved into when I had maybe 4 or 5 bosses left to kill, when I ran into major challenges. Overall, I was severely disappointed with Dark Souls 2 base game, bar a couple of outliers. When it gets down to it, I found that the biggest problem the bosses in Dark Souls 2 base game had were their health bars. So many bosses were trivialized, solely because they died in only a few hits. It may have been my quality straight-sword build, but I doubt that, because even in the later game when I did no more than 250, 260 damage a hit, the bosses continued to melt. Okay. With this section, I would like to go over some of my favorite bosses in the game, because I believe they went above and beyond in one way or another. Firstly, the Flexile Sentry was certainly one of the more interesting bosses in the game. Not being able to circle strafe and attack from behind was a welcome addition, and I appreciated the dynamic between the two sides of the boss. What I also liked was something I did not even notice until later in the fight. I was taking a slower, more reserved attempt at the boss and thought it would be best just to take my time in order to slowly whittle the boss down. That was until I noticed that my movement speed and rolls began to slow down. The water in the room was rising. This aspect of the fight took me by surprise and made me realize that I needed to kill this boss quickly before I could not avoid any of his attacks anymore. I loved how the room played a role in the encounter, and that was not just total bullcrap like some of the other boss rooms, Mytha. In the end, the boss was not too tough, but the aspects such as the water and the two-side dynamic does push this boss up on my list of favorites in Dark Souls 2. Next is a multiples boss fight, the Belfry Gargoyles. The Gargoyles fight was actually one of my favorite horde fights in the game, if that's not too hard to believe. I can see why many people would say that this is just From trying to one-up the first Dark Souls Bell Gargoyles encounter by having you fight 4 at a time rather than just 2. But I found that, of all the horde fights within the game, this was the best. The Gargoyles themselves were not too aggressive. They never usually attacked one after another constantly, to the point where you had no time to think or react. This boss gives you lapses in time to avoid, circle, and wait for an opening, while the Gargoyles laid back as well and attacked on occasion. I also fought this boss later in my playthrough because I totally missed it, and I have no doubt that I would have found it a lot more overwhelming if I was weaker than I was. Overall, I did not mind this fight and give props for a genuinely good horde fight because it did not go down the route of merely overwhelming the player with sheer numbers. The Looking Glass Knight was, in my opinion, one of the best men-in-armor fights during the base game of Dark Souls 2. This boss has a decent moveset, if not a little easy to avoid, but the way that it implemented ads into the fight was so creative in my eyes. Having the ad come out of his mirror shield was so cool, and at the same time, the ad itself was not too hard to deal with, and it made sense to have it in the boss encounter. Secondly, having the boss act almost like a lightning rod during the storm and using lightning to attack the player from rage was thematically and mechanically interesting. The Looking Glass Knight also had a sizable health pool in comparison to many other bosses in the base game, and it actually made the fight last a little longer than most. So I do give the boss points for that. I like it when I actually get to see the boss for more than 60 seconds. Also, this boss felt more like an equal than some other men in armor fights, because usually they felt a lot weaker than me, due in part to their minimal movesets and health. Dragon Rider. Regardless, I really did like this boss for what it was, and it went way above some other knights in the base game. The next boss I want to discuss is Dark Lurker. This boss was probably one of the more difficult bosses in the base game. However, as a rapid moving melee like myself, I found many of his abilities to be easily avoidable. If the boss was a little quicker, it definitely would have been exponentially more difficult than it was. I also really liked how the boss split in two about halfway during the fight. Yet, a part of me wishes that they did not share health and acted more like the opponent fight. But you cannot win them all, and I still like that mechanic. The boss was also one of the coolest aesthetically in my opinion. Having a boss named Dark Lurker resemble an angel was definitely interesting. Maybe if From ever remasters Dark Souls 2, they could give Dark Lurker the title of Edgelord. But when it gets down to it, that's all I really had to say about Dark Lurker. He was a cool boss and definitely worth the trouble of getting to him through all the Covenant things and all that, but I definitely think he could have used a larger health pool, but I think that's just a problem with the Dark Souls 2 base game in general. Finally, I want to talk about Vendrick. It may be strange to have Vendrick be considered one of my favorite bosses, but for me, after messing up the Aldia questline, I decided it would be best just to send the game off on Vendrick. After killing every other boss and gathering my 5 giant souls, I went in there ready to face the Hollowed King. The boss himself was far from difficult, but I do not think that was the point for this boss. I noticed how slowly he moved. The weight of his sword bore an obvious burden on him. It was hard for him to fight you due to his withered state. Vendrick was a pathetic figure. Everything, his armor, his humanity, even his title of king was stripped from him, and he was left circling endlessly in the undead crypt, hollowed and alone. I believe Vendrick was meant to be a representation of you, the player, if you were to give up as he did. However, that is what separates you from Vendrick, and what makes you the true monarch. You did not lose hope. After killing Vendrick, I was left in the undead crypt, almost sad, hurt that he died, because instead of feeling anger or apathy towards him, I felt sorry for him. No one, by the time you get to Majula, liked Vendrick. What I did was almost like putting the king out of his misery. And I believe now that it was possibly best that I messed up the Aldia questline, because I would not have been able to finish the game with Vendrick if I had continued that questline. In the very end, I think that Vendrick was a fitting last boss for Dark Souls 2. After discussing the main game, I want to delve a little bit into the DLC of Dark Souls 2. I could say that with utmost certainty that the DLC was definitely the best part about the entire game. From took a major turn with how encounters went about and when it came to fighting enemies in general. There were far fewer instances where I was faced with multiple enemies at a time, and it appeared as if From decided to move towards the more one-on-one fights more often, and I really did appreciate that change of pace. The layout of the DLCs was also really good in terms of level design. Whether it be shortcuts using verticality or obscuring sight, I absolutely loved how the levels were done in the DLC, especially the Crown of the Ivory King with Ilium Lois. The Frigid Outskirts is the exception, however. I hate that zone. Let's not dilly-dally and move on towards the bosses. The bosses in the DLC were top-notch, for the most part. They were pretty much the opposite to the base game, where most of the bosses were not so great, but with a couple of good outliers. I want to go over the bosses that I really enjoyed, and one that really kind of pissed me off. The first boss I want to discuss is Fume Knight. The Fume Knight was by far the most difficult boss in the entire game for me. There was a large moveset, he was aggressive, and he was simply a phenomenal fight. The thing is, however, Fume Knight, for me at least, had a horrible hitbox problem. There were multiple instances where I would be on his side or even behind him, but still get hit, even though he was doing a forward thrust or a downward strike. For me, Fume Knight can be compared to a trash can fire. It provides adequate warmth, but at the cost of smelling like garbage. That hitbox had me bent out of shape for so long. Here are a couple of examples of why I'm just simply pissed off at that hitbox. And if those don't convince you, this death was my favorite.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
I looked into the Fume Knight and found that many others had similar issues, while at the same time another group claimed they had no problems. At first I had a hard time believing how people did not have hitbox issues with Fume Knight, but that was until I went and fought Sir Alon, and discovered something that changed my game dramatically. Like I mentioned when I discussed how From made the player weaker and such, I believe now that the roll and lowered invincibility frames were perhaps the issue I was having with Fume Knight and his hitbox. However, I did not discover the degree in which invincibility frames were weakened until Sir Alon. Before I delve into that, I probably attempted Sir Alon over 24 times. The way to the boss was well cleared out by the time he had died, and I have to say that Sir Alon is my personal favorite boss in the game. While I cannot say he was more difficult than Fume Knight due to those hitbox problems, Sir Alon was an amazing experience because, unlike Fume Knight, Alon felt fair. He was quick, meticulous, and you needed to be on point to kill this boss. Having a combination of delayed and hastened attacks all come together as it did was awesome because Alon was not only extremely tough, but like I said, he was fair. Every time I messed up, there was not a thought in the back of my mind thinking that it was a hitbox issue rather than me properly making a mistake. On the other hand, this animation here pissed me off 100% of the time. Every time it happened. It was a legitimate mess up on my part, but seeing that irked me. But now I want to go back into what I discovered with Sir Alon. It was agility. Note, I have said it before and I'll say it again. I was almost done with the game in terms of bosses. 4 or so in the base game, and the 2 DLC after the Crown of the Iron King. And it was only when I fought Sir Alon that I discovered agility. After dozens of attempts on Sir Alon, I was getting frustrated about my rolls because it felt like regardless of what I did, I could not avoid these attacks. Especially the one where it jumps straight up into the air and slams down. It was then I put my foot down and had to figure out if I was missing something. There had to be something wrong with my roll. I did some research on invincibility frames and found that there was, in fact, a stat that affects the player's invincibility frames. That was agility. For the entire game, even Fume Knight, I was running with 85 agility because I never touched either attunement or adaptability because for one, I did not know what adaptability did and I was going with a quality build, so I needed to put all my points into strength and dexterity. When I discovered that you could increase your invincibility frames, I immediately respec'd my character, taking some points out of dexterity and vigor and pumped my adaptability up to the point where I had 100 agility. Afterwards, I went to Sir Alon and killed him in 2 attempts. Everything clicked in that very moment. I was having all this trouble with traversing the world and all that because I had almost no invincibility with my roll. I looked into it later and found that 85 agility, what I was running with up to Sir Alon, converted to 5 iframes. That is 0.167 seconds of time where I was invincible. When I got my agility up to 100, It turns out that my iframes jumped to 12. That is 0.4 seconds of invincibility. I literally almost tripled the amount of time I was invincible because of that change. And for what? Losing 10 points of damage on my right hand weapon? There was no doubt in my mind that I, with this change, consequently nerfed the entirety of the rest of the game. To think, I thought the bosses in the base game were easy before. I could only imagine how much easier the game would have been if I had invested into adaptability earlier. This was the moment I realized that From weakened the player rather than making the world more difficult. Getting back on track, I was actually genuinely disappointed after I killed Alon, in all honesty. I did not get the same rush after defeating him like I did with Fume Knight. I had nerfed the game with one stat, and it is not to say that Sir Alon's fight was worse off because of my change. In fact, it felt like I cheated myself. Sir Alon is still by far my favorite fight, but the significance of that agility increase was probably too much. Okay, let's move on to the Ivory King. Of all the bosses in the Crown of the Ivory King DLC, I want to discuss Ava. This boss took me by surprise because of how long it took me to actually defeat him. It was not because he was overly difficult in terms of his attacks, because when you whittle everything down, his attacks were not that special, he was just another beast boss. The thing that got me was the delay in his attacks. For so long, and in all honesty, I still do not fully grasp. I struggled with learning the timings behind his attacks. I was always too fidgety and rolled too early, and that got me so many times. He was not necessarily difficult, but I could just not adjust to how late his attacks seemed to come out, and I don't know. I really just liked how this boss's dynamic revolved around that delay in his swipes and such. Moving on to the Crown of the Sunken King, Sin, the Slumbering Dragon, is a boss I want to go over. This boss is easily in my top 5 favorites of Dark Souls 2. He is an awesome dragon fight that bends Ancient Dragon over a barrel and goes to town. How the boss uses Toxic in a reasonable way, unlike one other boss, was very cool because From managed to put in an effect like that into a boss without it coming off as cheap. Now you could have more than a few reasons to avoid his fire attacks. And the way that it lingers to restrict movement was, like I said, very cool. Also, the similarities to Calamite were welcome and not too pervasive. And how Sin actually attacks you when you are at his side and behind him was probably one of the most unique mechanics I've ever seen from a dragon fight. It was probably thought up when it came to be that, from my observations, Sin's back legs were his weak point, which is interesting because usually it's the head for dragons. Also, I really enjoyed the aggressiveness of this boss. Not all bosses can get away with being this aggressive, especially in Dark Souls 2. But it was very fitting for someone like Sin, and it made it to where the healing was that little bit more difficult to gauge because he was almost always ready to take another swing at you. It also ties into the Toxic if you happen to be afflicted by it like I was on my kill. You have to make sure you get that healing before you die, but Sin does not make it easy for you. If I had one gripe with this boss, it would be how quickly my weapon degrades. It is not usually the case where my weapon could go from full durability to almost broken in a single boss battle. I do not know if the resin I used had anything to do with it, but it may have been simply the boss himself or something, I don't know. Maybe his rock hard skin was like swinging against a wall perhaps. But that does it for me talking about Dark Souls 2. While Dark Souls 2 has many downs, it definitely has its fair share of good moments that prevents me from saying that this game sucks, one through a better part none. There were those few bosses in the base game, and the DLC was definitely the highlight. When it gets down to it, after looking over everything in hindsight and ignoring the salty casual in me, I can say that Dark Souls 2 is not half bad. I cannot say that it's totally in line with Dark Souls 1 and 3, but the same thing can be said about the other two games as well. I have a collection of gripes for the two of them too. Overall, I want to say that I'm glad I played Dark Souls 2, and it has most definitely made me appreciate the other two games even more, and even wish that some aspects of Dark Souls 2 were in 1 and 3 as well, such as the slowed healing. I did grow to love that mechanic. Anyway, before I get off on a tangent, I want to know what you guys thought about Dark Souls 2. What do you love or hate about it? Do you agree or disagree with what I said? Other than that, if you have any questions, quarrels, or queries, be sure to let me know. I'm Cucumber, and remember, past addressing.